Hi there, welcome to the Firm Foundation series. My name is Dale Yancey. Today we're on lesson 37, Home for the Holidays, Returning to the Promised Land. Well, the Jews of 5th century BC had a hard time being optimistic. I mean, who could blame them? Less than a century earlier, their beloved Judah, their capital city Jerusalem, and their pride and joy, God's temple, had all been destroyed by the Babylonians. Now they're in exile, and their culture lay in danger of disappearing through assimilation. And theologically, they struggle with issues. They're asking questions as to why did God allow all these terrible things to happen to us? And so often we look at what's going on all around us or in our own personal lives and we ask the question, why? Why, God? Why is this happening? Why is all this turmoil going on in the world? The Bible's answer to this question of why was that God hadn't abandoned his people, but that rather they had abandoned him through their continual disregard for his commandments. But things didn't have to stay that way. If they would turn back to God and mend their ways, God would restore them to the promised land. And this is exactly what happens here in today's lesson. Thanks in large part to a Persian king by the name of Cyrus the Great, who issues a decree allowing those in exile to return to their ancestral home, and thanks to those brave souls who took him up on his offer, Jerusalem and its temple are eventually rebuilt, and the Jews find themselves once again back in their homeland. As in our last lesson, I want to let you know that some of the material for today's lesson comes from the Bible for Dummies by Jeffrey Gagan, Professor of Biblical Theology at Boston College, and Dr. Michael Homan, Professor of Biblical Studies at Xavier University of Louisiana, and is published by the Wiley Publishing Company. Their book, The Bible for Dummies, is an excellent resource to give you a better understanding of the Bible. They explain everything in plain English along with some great illustrations, and of course they throw in a dose of humor and wit. So if you want to get a better understanding overall of the Bible as you're going through this Firm Foundation series, go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble and order this outstanding resource, The Bible for Dummies. Also, I want to remind you about our website, foundationstudy.weebly.com. The address is right here on the screen, and you can go there and you can download notes for today's lesson as well as all the past lessons, and we also have all the videos starting with the very first one. So go to foundationstudy.weebly.com to download notes and videos, all right? And also let your friends know about our website. Now let's review last week's lesson, 36, Strangers in a Strange Land. Question number 1. What year were the Jews in Judah attacked by Babylon? A. 430 BC, B. 560 BC, C. 586 BC, or D. 742 BC? The answer is C. 586 BC. 2. What year were Daniel and the Jews deported from Jerusalem to Babylon? In 605 BC. And 3. Why did God allow Judah to be invaded? Because Israel had ignored God's covenant. 4. Besides ignoring the Sabbath, what else did the Jews ignore in terms of violating God's covenant? They ignored the sabbatical year, allowing the land to rest every 7th year. 5. What did Daniel's diet consist of? Vegetables and water. 6. Was it the diet that made Daniel and his friends healthier and stronger? No, it was God. 7. When they were forced to enroll in Babylon University, what was one of the first things that was forced on Daniel and his 3 friends, alerting them that they were now engaged in a great cultural battle? Well, they were all given names of Babylonian gods. 8. How did Daniel and his 3 friends gain all their knowledge and wisdom while studying at Babylonian U? God gave it to them. 9. Why were Daniel's 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, thrown into the fiery furnace? It's because they refused to bow down and worship the 90-foot gold statue. And 10. What happens to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego while they are in the fiery furnace? Well, they're not touched by the fire, with not even the smell of smoke on their clothing, and a 4th person like the Son of Man or the Messiah is in there with them. 11. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream where he saw a tree and an angel said to cut down the tree, but leave the stump and the roots in the ground, and let him live with the animals of the field for 7 years. What did Daniel tell Nebuchadnezzar would happen? God caused the king to go insane because of his pride. He lived like a wild animal with his nails as long as eagle's claws and his hair as long as bird's feathers, and he ate grass for 7 years. 12. Why did God cause this to happen to Nebuchadnezzar? Because of his pride. 13. Does God keep his word? Yes. 14. Daniel's called in to interpret the handwriting on the wall at Belshazzar's feast. What was the interpretation given by Daniel? You've been weighed on God's moral scales and have been found wanting, and tonight your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. 15. Did God do what Daniel said? Yes. God did exactly what the handwriting on the wall said. 16. How many times a day did Daniel pray? 3. 17. For those who say that my religion is a private thing between me and God, what did Daniel do to let everyone know that he worshiped the Almighty God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He threw open his window and he prayed in front of the window 3 times daily so that he could be seen by all. 18. Daniel refused to pray to King Darius, and what happens to him as a result of his convictions? He is thrown into a den of lions. And finally, 19. What does King Darius do when he notices that Daniel has spent the night with the lions and remains unharmed? He orders that those who enticed him into making this stupid, evil law be thrown into the lion's den, along with their families, and they are eaten alive before their bodies even hit the floor. Let's start with A. Cyrus the Great's great idea. Theme here is God is loving, merciful, and gracious. He always keeps his promises. Theme also is God is all-knowing and all-powerful. Well, the book of Ezra reveals 2 main issues that were facing these returning exiles. Number 1 was their struggle to restore the temple, and number 2 was the need for spiritual reformation. And both were necessary in order for the people to renew their relationship with the Lord. Now on the timeline, notice the sequence of events. You have June through August, 605 BC, the first siege of Israel. I've put a red arrow pointing to this date there on the timeline, and now at this point Israel is no longer a sovereign nation, and the Jews, including Daniel, are taken captive to Babylon. And then December 598 to March 16th, 597 BC, I put a purple arrow pointing to this date on the timeline. This is the second siege where numerous Jews are taken captive, including the prophet Ezekiel. Then we have January 15th, 588 BC to July 16th, 586 BC. I've marked this date with a yellow arrow on the timeline, and this is the third siege. Jerusalem and the temple are destroyed on August 19th, 586 BC, and numerous Jews are taken captive, including the prophet Jeremiah. Cyrus the Great not only overthrows the unpopular Babylonian Empire in 539 BC, notice the green arrow pointing to that year on this timeline, but Cyrus also encourages his new subjects to go back to their homelands and revive their former way of life. The Jews were no exception to Cyrus's rule. So in 538 BC, and notice the blue arrow there on the timeline, this points to 538 BC when King Cyrus releases Israel from captivity and allows them, in fact he even encourages them with money and support to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. This timeline depicts the 70 years of Babylonian captivity that was prophesied by Jeremiah, and this 70 years of punishment in exile is about to come to an end. Cyrus permits any Jews who so desire to return to Judah and rebuild God's temple. Let's read Ezra chapter 1. The promise the Lord has spoken to Jeremiah was about to come true in Cyrus's first year as king of Persia. The Lord inspired the king to make this announcement throughout his whole kingdom and then put it in writing. And this is what King Cyrus of Persia says. The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the world. Then he ordered me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. May God be with all of you who are his people. You may go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build a temple for the Lord God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. All who choose to remain behind, wherever they may be living, should provide the people who are leaving with silver, gold, supplies, livestock, and freewill offerings to be used in God's temple in Jerusalem. Then the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, the priests and the Levites, everyone God had inspired, they came forward to rebuild God's temple there in Jerusalem. All their neighbors who were remaining behind, they provided them with articles made from silver and gold, supplies, livestock, and valuable gifts, besides everything that was freely offered. King Cyrus brought out the utensils belonging to the Lord's temple. Nebuchadnezzar had taken these utensils from Jerusalem and put them in the temple of his own God. King Cyrus of Persia put the treasurer Mithridath in charge of bringing them out. So Mithridath made a list of them for Prince Sheshbazzar of Judah. This is the inventory. Gold dishes 30, silver dishes 1,000, knives 29, Gold bowls, 30. Other silver bowls, 410. Other utensils, 1,000. Now the gold and silver utensils, they totaled 5,400. Sheshbazzar took all these utensils with him when the exiles left Babylon to go back to Jerusalem. The Babylonians had captured Judah in either 607 or 586 BC. There's some disagreement over which year it actually occurred. The exile of Judah lasted just as the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied to the exact year. The exile ended just as God had promised, and now this was the first of 3 deportations or returns back to Jerusalem. Now we are told that the heart of King Cyrus, was turned or inspired to allow the Jews to return to their homeland. And once again we see the providence of God, the invisible hand of God. God is Lord over all, and He can influence the heart and mind of anyone, any ruler, or anyone in authority. And when you look at history, you need to realize that people make decisions and judgments were made without any thought or regard to God, but yet God's invisible hand is moving them like chess pieces. See, God is in control. History is His story, and He's still at work today. He's writing His story in your life, my life, as well as in this world. So Cyrus's proclamation sounds as if he too worships Jehovah God. But you see, he may just have been an accommodating kind of ruler, and his profession of faith may only have been as much as skin deep. A great many conquerors were religious men, but we're left to wonder whether or not he really knew Jehovah as the one true God. But for the sake of argument today and for this lesson, let's give King Cyrus the benefit of the doubt that just maybe he was a true believer in Jehovah God, in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would be a great thing. And maybe that's what moved him to allow the Jews to return back and rebuild the temple and the walls. Now we come to B. There's no place like home. The Jews who return home to Judah. Theme here is that God is faithful. He never changes. He always keeps His promises. Well, the essence of the proclamation is a permission to return for anyone who wished to do so, a sanction for rebuilding the temple, and an order to the native inhabitants to render help in the terms of money, goods, as well as livestock. A further contribution toward the building was suggested as a free will offering. The return then was not to be at the expense of the king, and nor was any tax to be laid upon the people, but it was neighborly goodwill born of 70 years of association that was involved. And as we find, it was not in vain. God had given the people there in Babylon favor in the eyes of those who had carried them away captive. But after long years of residence in Babylon, many Israelites had settled in. They made a home there in Babylon, and they were well connected with family and friends, so that they had lost some of their homesickness. See, one reason is frankly given by the historian Josephus. He writes, "Many remained in Babylon, not wishing to leave their possessions behind them. But just as God had stirred the heart of King Cyrus to make this proclamation, so also God stirred the hearts of some of the Israelites to return to Jerusalem. And those who stayed behind were held back by love of an easy life, or fear of the journey, or love of money and possessions." How many of us have had great opportunities offered for us to do service for the Lord, but we've let them slip in a similar manner? We've had doors open, but somehow we've been too lazy, or too cowardly, or too much afraid of self-denial to enter in. And the tragedy is that that's a crime for many in this life. It's easier to live among the low levels of the plain of Babylon than to take on the dangers, privations of a weary tramp across the desert. The ruins of Jerusalem are a much less comfortable abode than the well-furnished houses which have to be left behind. And those who are practical would say, just be content with where you are and let other people take the trouble of doing such a mad scheme as trying to rebuild the temple. I mean, we can come up with 1,000 excuses ringing in our ears for not doing what God wants us to do, and the rest of our lives will be empty as a result. You see, it'll be nothing but neglected opportunities, unheeded calls to do God's will. That's all we're going to have in our lives. It's just missed opportunities. The saddest of all words is, it might have been. How much wiser and happier and nobler were the daring souls that rose to the occasion. They cast away a life of ease, wealth, possessions, even family and friends. They left them behind because they heard the divine call of God, and they responded by saying, "Here am I, Lord, send me." And one other point to be made about this passage is the inventory of the temple vessels returned by Cyrus. Here's what I find amazing about the inventory of all the utensils and items that have been taken from the temple there in Jerusalem. They totaled 5,400 in number, and they were very valuable. And King Cyrus decides to let go of them. He decides to give them up so they can be returned to the rightful owners, the Jews, and returned to the rightful home there in Jerusalem in the rebuilt temple. This is amazing. Also, we see that those who take up the call to return to Jerusalem are generously given gold, silver, and livestock by their neighbors as a freewill offering. In other words, no one forced them to do this. They wanted to give towards this effort. This is often what we do when we send out a missionary family to another country. Churches will take up offerings, and people will freely give to help the missionary family move and get settled and to provide for their ongoing work. Another reason why there's an enumeration of all these items totaling 5,400 in number is that there was a pride and joy in the writer of the book of Ezra that these items, like bowls and knives, were being returned to Jerusalem as a pledge towards the reestablishment of the temple and worship there in the temple. We're told that those returning from Babylonian captivity to Jerusalem, they numbered 49,897, which included 7,337 servants, as well as 200 male and female singers. We're told that they were carrying 1,030 pounds of gold, 5,740 pounds of silver, 100 robes for the priests, and everything arrived safely in Jerusalem, and it was accounted for. Not 1 ounce of gold or silver was missing. Nothing was stolen. And here's what I find so amazing. On a journey like this, there are always going to be bandits and robbers and thieves hiding up in the hills who would come down and they would rob travelers. You see, I believe that God's hand of protection kept any robbers away from these returning Jews. It seems that Sheshbazzar and his fellow returnees began laying the foundations of the temple, but for some unknown reason, they were unable to complete the task. And now we come to C, the second temple. 18 years after the initial return of the exiles under Sheshbazzar, work begins anew on the temple, but this time the returnees are led by a man named Zerubbabel. Let's read Ezra chapter 3, starting verse 7. So they gave money to the stonecutters and carpenters. Then they gave food, drink, and olive oil to the men from Sidon and Tyre in exchange for cedar, which the men would bring by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as King Cyrus of Persia had authorized them to do. Zerubbabel, who was Shealtiel's son, Jeshua, who was Josedek's son, and the rest of the Jews, the priests, the Levites, and all the others who had come back from exile to Jerusalem, they began to rebuild the temple. This happened in the second month of the second year following their return to the site of God's house in Jerusalem. They began by appointing the Levites, who were at least 20 years old, to direct the work on the Lord's house. So they begin where the first wave of returnees left off, rebuilding the temple. They start by rebuilding the central altar, which allows them to offer sacrifices to God. Then they begin to work on the temple itself. And when the foundation is laid, most of the people shout for joy. However, when those familiar with the temple see the diminished size of the new foundation, they weep, realizing that the temple will in no way compare to Solomon's glorious structure. Despite these mixed emotions, the people busy themselves with the construction of the new temple. Now we come to D, Ezra the priest. Theme here is man can come to God only according to God's will and plan. Ezra chapters 4 through 6, we find that the Samaritans are trying to interfere in the building of the temple. Now you might remember that the Samaritans consisted of people resettled by the Assyrians from southern Mesopotamia. They weren't legitimate Israelites. The returning Israelites considered them to be intruders who were trying to hinder the work of rebuilding the temple. Well, years pass and the temple remains unfinished. Realizing the people need a little motivation, God calls the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to do their stuff. Haggai plays the role of bad cop, as it were. He's chastising the people for fixing up their own homes while neglecting the house of God. Zechariah plays the good cop. He's envisioning a day when the Judean monarchy will be restored. And motivated by the prophet's preaching, the people once again begin rebuilding the temple. About 50 years after Zerubbabel's return and rebuilding of the temple, Ezra arrives on the scene. Ezra is sent by the Persian king Artaxerxes to find out how things are going there in Judea. Ezra has a letter from the king in his possession, which grants Ezra the authority to use money from the Persian treasury to tend to any unfinished business in rebuilding the Israelites' lives there in their homeland of Jerusalem. When Ezra arrives in Jerusalem around 458 BC, he discovers that the people are not well informed about their religious heritage. Kind of like today. As people here in America, we're not well informed about our heritage as a nation. And there are many who still believe in the separation of church and state. They believe that that's in the Constitution, when it's not. We need someone like Ezra today to call us as a people back to God. Well, Ezra begins to set about to teach the people about the law of Moses, and he implements religious and civil reforms to ensure that they're following God's laws as recorded in the Bible. Ezra is effectively made the leader of the Jewish community in Jerusalem by a Persian royal commission. And shortly after Ezra arrives to enact religious reforms, a large group of people approach Ezra and they confess. Here's what they confess to him. It's found in Ezra chapter 10, verse 2. We've been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women who came from the people around us. However, there's still hope for Israel. So we must now make a promise to our God to get rid of all foreign women and the children born to them, as my Lord Ezra and the others who tremble at the commandments of our God have advised us to do. We must do what Moses' teachings tell us. Well, Ezra is very disturbed to learn of the interfaith marriages, and he forces the priests who have married local women to take an oath to immediately divorce their wives and families. Then Ezra summons all the returned exiles to assemble within 3 days there in Jerusalem. Heavy rains increase the drama as the people gather. They're drenched as they hear that they must abandon their families. According to Ezra, some priests and laymen oppose the plan, but in the end, all are forced to divorce their wives and children. Now, Ezra's insistence that these men divorce their foreign wives and their children, it may strike you as peculiar. It may even strike you as being very cruel. To explain, though, divorce is largely discouraged if not condemned in the Bible. Secondly, other biblical authors seem to be more tolerant of intermarriage between neighboring peoples. For example, all the kings of Judah, as descendants of King David, they stem from intermarriage of the Moabite woman Ruth and her Israelite husband. But nevertheless, in Ezra's defense, it's quite possible that such interfaith marriages would have destroyed the Jews' religious identity due to assimilation, so he insists that the men get divorced. And really, this matter is so important because it's for the purity of the Jews, that they will remain pure and not be assimilated into all these other cultures that worship false gods and have all these evil, despicable customs. So God wanted his people to remain pure and separate, and that's why he wanted all the men to divorce their wives and children, to remove themselves from these families. Now we come to E, Nehemiah the builder. Can we fix it? Oh, yes we can. The theme here is man must have faith in order to please God and be saved. Let's read Nehemiah chapter 1. These are the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, during the month of Chislev, in Artaxerxes' 20th year as king, while I was in the fortress of Susa. One of my brothers, Hanani, arrived with some men from Judah. I asked them about the Jews who had survived captivity and about Jerusalem. They told me, those who survived captivity are in the province. They're enduring serious troubles and they're being insulted. The wall of Jerusalem has been broken down, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. When I heard this, I sat down and I cried. I mourned for days. I continued to fast and pray to the God of heaven. I said, Lord God of heaven, great and awe-inspiring God, you faithfully keep your promise and show mercy to those who love you and obey your commandments. Open your eyes and pay close attention with your ears to what I, your servant, am praying. I am praying to you this day and night about your servants, the Israelites. I confess the sins that we Israelites have committed against you, as well as the sins that my father's family and I have committed. We have done you a great wrong. We haven't obeyed the commandments, the laws, or regulations that you gave us through your servant Moses. Please remember what you told us through your servant Moses. If you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and continue to obey my commandments, though your people may be driven to the most distant point on the horizon, I will come and get you from there and bring you to the place where I chose to put my name. These are your servants and your people whom you love and whom you have saved by your great power and your strong hand. Lord, please pay attention to my prayer, to the prayers of all your other servants who want to worship your name. Please give me success today and make this man, King Artaxerxes, show me compassion. I was a cupbearer to the king at this time. Well, Nehemiah is the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, which meant that he would daily come before the king, and his role was a deadly one. He was charged with the responsibility of tasting the king's drink before the king would even touch it. so that if it was poisoned in any way, the one who would die would be Nehemiah. These cupbearers in some cases also tasted the food to make sure that it was not seasoned with some poison as well. Well, Nehemiah gets word that the Jews in Jerusalem are being insulted and that they're in serious trouble. And to add insult to injury, the walls surrounding the city are broken down in great disrepair. In a sense, the walls provide a visual image of the Jewish people there in Jerusalem. They need some help. They need encouragement. And Nehemiah is so distressed that he sits down and he cries. And then he fasts, and he's in a state of mourning for days. He then calls out to God and intercedes on behalf of his people, asking God to forgive Israel for all the sins that they've committed, including Nehemiah himself and his family. He states that they, as God's people, have not obeyed God's commandments or laws that were given through Moses. He finally asks God to give him success as he approaches the king with this matter. He asks God to work on the king's heart so that he'll have compassion on the Israelites there in Judea. Well, even though the Jews had been back in the homeland for nearly 100 years, the walls in Jerusalem still lay in ruins. Because walls were a city's primary means of defense, Nehemiah knew that the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls was essential for the protection of the Jews against their enemies. The broken down walls were a picture of the Jews there in Jerusalem. For the past 100 years, they were still broken and hurting. Even as Nehemiah needed to shore up the walls of Jerusalem, he was also being called to shore up the remnant that had returned there to Jerusalem. Not only does the king give Nehemiah permission to go to Jerusalem, he gives Nehemiah an armed escort as well as permission to use the empire's resources to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. So Nehemiah's prayer was most definitely answered by Jehovah God. He gave Nehemiah great favor with King Artaxerxes. Now we come to F, rebuilding Jerusalem's walls. The theme here is God is our shield and defender, our ever-present help in time of trouble. When Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, he surveys the damage to the walls. He begins to organize the people for work. Nehemiah wisely decides to have the people work on the walls according to their family groups and near the location of their houses. Nehemiah's strategy ensures that the people remain motivated in their work because rebuilding the walls means protection for their own homes. However, once word gets out that the Jews are rebuilding the walls, the Samaritans begin to rise up in opposition, and they even threaten violence. The threat of attack requires that the Jews work on the walls with a tool in one hand and a sword in the other. There are even several attempts on Nehemiah's life. Let's read about some of what Nehemiah encountered. Nehemiah 4, starting verse 4. Nehemiah prayed, "O God, hear us. We're despised. Turn their insults back on them and let them be robbed in the land where they are prisoners. Don't ignore their guilt. Don't let their sins disappear from your records. They've insulted you in front of these builders." So we rebuilt the wall, which was rebuilt about half its original height. The people worked with determination. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs and the Ammonites and the people from Ashdod heard that the repair work on the walls of Jerusalem was making progress and that the gaps were being filled in, they became furious. All of them plotted to attack Jerusalem to create confusion. But we prayed to our God, and we set guards to protect us day and night. Then the people of Judah said, "The work crews are worn out, and there is too much rubble. We can't continue to rebuild the wall." Our enemies said, "Before they know what's happening or see a thing, we'll be right in the middle of them. We'll kill them and bring the work to an end." Jews who were living near our enemies warned us 10 times that our enemies would attack us from every direction. That is why I positioned people by their families behind the wall where it was lowest and most exposed. The people were armed with swords, spears, and bows. I looked them over and proceeded to tell the nobles, the leaders, and the rest of the people, "Don't be afraid of our enemies. Remember how great and awe-inspiring the Lord is. Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." When our enemies heard that we knew about their plots and that God had prevented their plans from being successful, we all went back to the work on the wall. Each person performed his own job. From that day on, half of my men worked on the wall, the other half were wearing body armor or holding spears and shields and bows. The leaders stood behind all the Judeans who were rebuilding the wall. The workers who were carrying loads did the work with one hand and held their weapons with the other, and each builder had his sword fastened to his side. The man who was supposed to sound the trumpet alarm was with me. I told the nobles, the leaders, and the rest of the people, "So much work has to be done in different places that we are widely separated from one another. When you hear the trumpet, a symbol around me. Our God will fight for us. Now here are some principles that we can learn from Nehemiah. Principle number 1. When you pray, expect answers. In Nehemiah 2:2, the king asks Nehemiah, "What do you want?" And here's what Nehemiah does. "So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I asked the king, if it please your majesty, and you are willing to grant my request, let me go to Judah, to the king where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it." Then, while the queen was sitting beside him, the king asked me, "And how long will you be gone, and when will you come back?" When I gave him a specific date, he was willing to let me go. I asked the king, "If it pleases your majesty, let me have letters addressed to the governors of the province west of the Euphrates River. In the letters, tell them to grant me safe conduct until I arrive there in Judah. Also, let me have a letter addressed to Asaph, the supervisor of your majesty's forest. In the letter, order him to give me wood for the gates of the fortress near the temple, for the city wall, and for the house I'll move into." The king let me have the letters because God was guiding me. Principle number 2. Seek the welfare of Israel. When Nehemiah arrived in the land of his fathers and delivered the king's letters to the rulers of the land, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Gershom, they were unhappy. And their response offers an important insight into what was in Nehemiah's heart and what he hoped to accomplish there in the promised land. Nehemiah 2:10, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, they were very upset that someone had come to give the people of Israel so much assistance." You see, Nehemiah's intent was not simply a construction project, nor was it just an effort to restore Jerusalem to a portion of her former glory. He had heard about the sorrow and the suffering of his brethren there in the land, and he sought their welfare. He sought the welfare of Israel. See, I believe God will always assist us in our endeavors and respond to our prayers when our desire is to seek the welfare of Israel. Principle number 3. Involve others. After his arrival, Nehemiah spent 3 days surveying the city and contemplating the work that would need to be done. He rode around the city by night, but he gave no indication of his purposes in Jerusalem there until he had a clear understanding of the nature of the work that lay before him and the work that needed to be done. The king of Persia made Nehemiah governor over the land of Judea, but he knew he could not do the required work alone. He therefore spoke to the priests, the nobles, the rulers, and the rest of the remnant. At the conclusion of 3 days, here's what Nehemiah said. Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17. "Then I told them, you see the trouble we're in? Jerusalem is in ruins, and its gates are burned down. Let's rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we'll no longer be insulted." And then I told them that my God had been guiding me, and what the king had told me. They replied, "Let's begin to rebuild." So they encouraged one another to begin this God-pleasing work. See, there were those who were opposed to the work, of course. The non-Israelite inhabitants of the land, they laughed with scorn, and they despised the Israelites, but the people were not deterred. Nehemiah 2:20 says, "The God of heaven will give us success." I answered them, "We, his servants, are going to rebuild. You have no property or claim or historic right in Jerusalem." You see, the Israelites were determined to rise up and build, so they strengthened their hands for this great work. Principle number 4, do your part. The purpose of the walls of the city was to protect Jerusalem from the encroachment of enemies. Thus, every section, every wall, indeed every single stone, was crucial to the safety of those who were within the walls. I mean, what would happen if one portion of the walls was left in ruin and an enemy attacked? Like the arrow that killed King Ahab in 1 Kings 22:34, a tiny gap might give an implacable enemy all the space that he needed to enter Jerusalem and destroy it. Chapter 3 teaches us that we must do our part in building the walls of protection around the people we love and serve, around our families, our neighbors, and those in our church family. And principle number 5 is expect opposition. This hostility to the work of building the kingdom is nearly continuous in Nehemiah's day as well as in ours. The report of this antagonism to the work of Nehemiah's people is interesting. Sanballat spoke to his brethren and the army of Samaria, and here's what he said. "What do these miserable Jews think they're doing? Can they rebuild it by themselves? Are they going to offer sacrifices? Can they finish it in a day? Will they get the stones out of the rubbish heaps, burned as these stones are, and give them new strength?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was beside Sanballat, said, "Even a fox would make their stone wall collapse if it walked on top of what they're building." Well, the work continued, but When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people from Ashdod heard that the repair work on the walls of Jerusalem was making progress and that the gaps were being filled in, they became furious. And Nehemiah counseled his brothers, and he said, I looked them over. I proceeded to tell the nobles, the leaders, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of our enemies. Remember how great and awe-inspiring the Lord is. Fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and for your homes. After a little speech, Nehemiah tells us, when our enemies heard that we knew about their plots and that God had prevented their plans from being successful, we all went back to the work on the wall. Each person performed his own job. And Nehemiah 4:16 says, from that day on, half of my men worked on the wall, the other half were wearing body armor and holding spears, shields, and bows. The leaders stood behind all the Judeans. One other verse explains a wonderful way to confront opposition. But we prayed to our God, and we set guards to protect us day and night. And finally, principle number 6 is, don't come down. The walls of Jerusalem are completed in an amazing 52 days. The final rocks and logs caused a renewed effort from the enemies of Israel. Sanballat, Tobiah, Gershom, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, they heard that I had rebuilt the wall, that no gaps had been left in it, although at that time I had not yet hung the doors in the city gates. Then Sanballat, Gershom, they sent this message to me. Let's meet in Hekephirim, in the plain of Ono. See, they were planning to harm me. I sent messengers to tell them, oh, I'm working on an important project right now and I can't get away. I mean, why should I stop work while I leave to go meet with you? Well, they sent the same message back to me 4 times, and I answered them the same way. All of the disciples of the Lord are doing a great work. And Lucifer would love to have us set the work aside and come down for a while so that he could do us in with some mischief. He would be delighted to have us spend our time in the plain of Ono. Another way to write this principle might be to say, stay away from the plain of oh no. You see, the repeated attempt of the enemies of the work to convince Nehemiah to come down, they speak to us in our own stewardships. See, when Lucifer sees us zealously building the walls of the kingdom, he always wants to impede our efforts. He always wants to sidetrack us and get us distracted. He'll try to entice us to come down from the walls and to engage in less fruitful activities. He'll have us chasing all kinds of different things that are unfruitful and that'll keep us from pursuing the work of the kingdom, that which God's called us to do. So despite these many obstacles, Nehemiah and his co-workers, they succeed in rebuilding the walls, and they do it in a record time of 52 days. A mere 52 days, and the walls were completed. Now there's just one thing left to do. They dedicate themselves and their newly fortified city to God. We come to G, rediscovering the Torah. The theme here is that God communicates with man. Well, Ezra's Watergate is the name of one of the main portals in Jerusalem's walls, seemingly located by the freshwater spring just southeast of the city. Near the Watergate at a public square, the former exiles gather in 445 BC to hear Ezra read the law of Moses. Many of them are hearing these laws for the very first time. Several of them no longer understand biblical Hebrew. So as a result, while Ezra is reading others in Israel's ancient legal code, they mingle among the crowd and they answer any questions that the people might have. Many of them weep as they hear their ancestral heritage and laws that they long ago have abandoned. They hear these laws being read for the very first time, and they're just crying tears. Ezra consoles them, and he instructs them that they shouldn't mourn, that they should celebrate this joyous occasion. Then we come to H. The people celebrate Sukkot. It's time to party on. Well, the following day, the people's leaders come to Ezra to study the words of the Torah much more closely. And to their amazement, they discover that according to the biblical calendar, it's the holiday of Booths, called Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. I mean, it's time to party. The Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, is the 7th and final feast given to Israel. It's observed in the fall. During this time, many Jewish families construct hastily built huts in which meals are eaten throughout the festival. The Feast of Tabernacles is used to remember the Sukkot, or the huts, that Israel lived in during their 40-year sojourn there in the desert after they came out of Egypt. Later, after Israel entered the land of promise, Sukkot was associated with the fall harvest. The Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, is celebrated for 8 days in Israel. Let's do questions for review here and see what you remember from today's lesson, okay? Make sure that you had a really good understanding of what we've been talking about. Question number 1. What Persian king issued a decree allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem? It was King Cyrus. 2. What was the date that Cyrus issued the decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland? Was it A, 496 BC, B, 538 BC, C, 562 BC? The answer is B, 538 BC. 3. How many deportations or returns were there to Judah? 3. 4. What prompted King Cyrus to allow the Jews to return to their homeland? God stirred his heart. And 5. According to Jeremiah's prophecy, how long had the Jews been captive there in Babylon? For 70 years. 6. Did all the Jews leave Babylon to move back to their homeland there in Judah? No. Only 5,400. Most of the Jews stayed behind there in Babylon. 7. Why did the Jews stay behind in Babylon, and why didn't they jump at the opportunity to return to their homeland? Well, it's because they had settled in. They built homes, businesses, they'd established connections with friends and family, and they were living comfortable lives. 8. Shortly after Ezra arrives in Judea, a large group of people approach him, and what do they confess? Well, they say, we've been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women who came from the people around us. And 9. What does Ezra tell the men to do? Ezra tells them to divorce their wives and children. And 10. Why does God want them to divorce their families? It's because intermarriage and assimilation will cause the Hebrew people, the Israelites, to lose their identity and their purity as Jews, God's holy people, set apart for his special purpose. 11. When Nehemiah, the cupbearer for the king, gets word that the Jews in Jerusalem are being insulted, threatened, and that the walls have been broken down by fire, what does he do? He cries, he mourns for days, he fasts, and he prays to God. And 12. How often did Nehemiah pray to God about this matter? Day and night. 13. What did he ask God to give him regarding King Artaxerxes? He asks for success as he approached the king, asking for permission to return to Jerusalem to help rebuild the walls. 14. Does God answer Nehemiah's prayer? Yes, most definitely. The king gives him permission as well as an armed escort and permission to use the empire's resources to rebuild the walls. 15. When Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, how does he wisely organize the people to rebuild the walls? He organizes them according to their families. He puts them to work on portions of the wall that are near their homes so they would have a vested interest in completing this work. 16. When Nehemiah gets word that their enemies are plotting to attack them while they're rebuilding the wall, what practical steps does Nehemiah take? We pray to our God, and we set guards to protect us day and night. 17. The walls were rebuilt in how many days? 52. 18. And how do the Israelites celebrate the completion of this work? By entering into the Feast of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, where they build huts and meals are eaten for 8 days. And finally, 19. And how do they learn about the Feast of Sukkot or the Feast of Tabernacles? They learn about it from Ezra, who brings out the Torah. He reads it to the people, and many are hearing the Word of God for the very first time in their lives. Well, that's it for today's lesson. Next time it's lesson 38, Praising for God, the Prophets. Until next time, this is Pastor Dale saying, may the blessing of God be upon you and your family. Until then, bye.